Welcome to Carbon Politics, a CSE podcast series decoding the politics of climate change from the lens of the Global South. In this series, we will explore multiple critical questions that are surrounding and pressuring the climate debate today. What happens next on multilateralism, or where is the current trade system going? And how does the global financial architecture need to be reformed? How are these systems influencing the ability of developing countries to address, respond to, and adapt to climate change? These are some of the critical questions we hope to answer, and we hope you join us on this journey this year. Welcome to Carbon Politics, the video podcast by the Center for Science and Environment. I'm Avantika Goswami, and today on this episode, we have a good friend and peer, Romain from Oil Change International. And welcome, Romain.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
To Carbon Politics. So today's episode is called Once Upon a Time in Dubai. And I think our specific community remembers Dubai for both, I guess, bits of good, bits of not so good. So in the previous episode, we were talking about the kind of cracks in multilateralism and what this means for climate action, and how there's a whole shift in the geopolitical order, which is making climate diplomacy, climate action look increasingly difficult. So a big sort of central player in this conversation, should I say player, should I say aspect, entity, are fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And at COP28 in Dubai, for the first time in a UN climate change outcome document, the need to transition away from fossil fuels was recognized in the outcome document of the Global Stocktake, which was agreed upon in Dubai. So it was a very significant moment for climate policy, where about 200 countries of the world with very different national circumstances came together and agreed that our energy systems need to be decarbonized. A number of other targets were agreed, like tripling renewable energy capacity and focusing on decarbonizing road transport, but transitioning away from fossil fuels. How significant was that moment, Romain? You were there, you were very involved.
Indeed, very involved. It was a hugely significant moment for all of us working on climate change, because we had been fighting for literally decades to get the UN climate negotiations to talk about the need to phase out fossil fuels. Because, as you said, they're 78 or 80% of the CO2 emissions globally, so there's no way to tackle the climate crisis without having a conversation on fossil fuels. And so it was a hugely significant moment to have an outcome on that, to say, okay, the direction of travel is actually to transition away from fossil fuels. The problem is that it didn't solve all the issues, and it didn't provide a roadmap on how countries were going to do that, basically. And so we're going to talk about that, but it's a first step, but it's definitely not the end of the road.
So that was a very significant moment where countries came together very cohesively to agree on this set of targets. But what we've also seen is that since then, since Dubai, and in fact over the past many decades, fossil fuel consumption and production has continued to rise, nevertheless. And although renewable-based power, electricity has been rising. It has been displacing quite a lot of fossil fuel use in many parts of the world. Renewable electricity is expected to actually overtake coal-based electricity sometime within this decade. We are still seeing expansion of coal, oil, and gas. Less so in some regions, more so in other regions. And what this is doing to carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions is continuing to just wreak climate havoc. So what are the factors that have actually led to sort of an unraveling of this scenario after Dubai? Why haven't the goals that we agreed on in Dubai, why haven't we been able to follow them?
I think there's a number of reasons. The first is that the goals themselves were pretty ambiguous. When you read the text of the Dubai Accord, it says transition away from fossil fuels in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. It doesn't say who needs to phase out what fossil fuel by when. It doesn't provide concrete target of we will, I don't know, collectively phase out fossil fuels by 50% by 2040 or something like that. There's nothing around that. So each country is free to interpret the agreement as it sees fit according to its national context. And so when then it's translated into national politics, then it becomes really tricky. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, for a lot of countries, there is just not the enabling conditions to allow them to get out of fossil fuels, right? If you're a highly indebted country that's highly dependent on fossil fuel revenues or revenues from fossil fuel exports, for instance, to run your economy, to industrialize, to fund your development, and the US is driving this massive oil and gas expansion in the world. So Trump wants energy dominance, but the reality is that they already have fossil energy dominance because they're such a driver of this. It's complicating, Trump is complicating things now because he's using LNG exports as a geopolitical weapon to try to bully countries into agreeing to better trade deals. So if you don't want to have tariffs slapped on your economy, you have to buy more of my gas, buy more of my LNG. And so that's where it's complicating things, because I don't think that was the approach of the Biden administration to the same degree.
Not as explicitly.
Not as explicitly. But the reality of U.S. expansion is that it's happening, and it's been happening for more than a decade. And so some of our data that we've had recently shows that the U.S. alone accounts for 60% of the CO2 that would come from new oil and gas production between now and 2035 alone. One country. If you add Canada, that's 70% between them two. So Canada is 10%. So oil and gas expansion primarily is a North American problem at this stage. And so I think it's important to keep that in mind when we look at the geopolitics of energy.
And how is this interacting with, you also have the OPEC countries, and some of them like Saudi Arabia have the biggest reserves, especially of oil. How are Trump's decisions interacting with other players? And if I could just add on something to that question, just to paint a slightly global picture, Trump also promised low prices, low energy prices, lower living costs to his domestic constituencies, but he wants to sell a lot of oil and gas and export a lot of it abroad. How does that affect his domestic constituencies and the cost of living crisis? So I guess outwardly, how do Trump's decisions interact with all of these factors?
I think there's a fundamental tension in what Trump wants and when he says he wants, right? He said he wants low fossil fuel, low energy prices for American citizens, but he wants a booming oil and gas industry at the same time.
Is that a paradox?
It is.
That's what I'm starting to learn that it might be. Like
in the US, it's kind of somewhat of a paradox because the US shale players in Texas and elsewhere, they're not low production cost players. It takes, for them to make money, the barrel of oil needs to be quite expensive, actually.
Right, for them to recover their costs. Yeah.
It's compared to Saudi Arabia, where the production costs are much lower. So now what we're seeing is OPEC actually, opening the tap, producing a lot more than they were before, to drive down prices, both to curry favor with Trump, to say, look, you've asked us to lower gas prices, we're delivering for you, and to kill their competitors in Texas, And so the technical term is reclaiming market shares, I think, which means kill the shale plays in Texas. And now you're starting to have industry players in the US, I think in the FT a couple of days ago, saying, actually, we expect that in the short term, because of low prices, oil production in the US will decline this year because we're not making any money, so we're cutting back on investment.
I mean, thank you, Saudi, I guess.
I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, from one perspective.
The collateral victim of all this is the climate, ultimately. But yeah. So, and the other thing I would say about the Saudi-US interplay on this is, in Dubai, you said that the countries were sort of cohesively, pushing for this. I don't think that was quite the case. Like a lot of countries, including Saudi Arabia, were like violently against an outcome on fossil fuels. And I think it took all the power of the Emirates to actually convince them to sign on to something. I don't know if you remember during the COP in Dubai, there was that letter from OPEC urging their members not to sign any language, not to agree to anything, etc. So there's also that interplay. They've been extremely clear on this thing, the Saudis, that they don't want it.
Yeah, no, and that's what makes the current scenario all the more, I would say, disappointing, tragic, is that outcome in Dubai was so hard fought.
Yeah.
And by no means would any of us assume that it was an easy win, especially when you have countries who depend on fossil fuel production for such a large percentage of their revenues. Their economies are not diversified. And I think despite that, we were able to win that outcome. But then the winds shifted almost immediately after, and all of these other things have kind of thrown a wrench in that and complicated that scenario. So I guess the question now is, who produces the last barrel of oil? Is that a question that it probably doesn't have an easy answer, but is there any possible answer? And what does this mean for the carbon budget and for the rest of the world?
So I think there's several things on this question. First, on the carbon budget, I think we need to be super clear. And I think now it's like a clear scientific consensus that just with the fossil fuels that we currently have, so just the oil fields, the gas fields, and the coal mines that we currently have, right? Without looking at new ones, if we burn all of that, we blow through the carbon budget for 1.5 and even for 2 degrees. That is something that we've shown as OCI for the past 10 years, basically. And it's obviously getting worse and worse because we keep opening new fossil fuels, right? It's getting so bad that actually 75%, that's our analysis, 75% of these fields that we currently have, they need to remain unextracted. So the carbon budget is essentially spent for 1.5 degrees when you look at this way.
And this is just oil and gas, not even coal.
And that's just oil and gas. That's all of them. And if you do oil, gas, and coal, you're above 2 degrees. And you just do oil and gas, you're above 1.5, basically. So that's the problem. Now, it's not just a question of like transitioning away in the distant future, like the Dubai agreement seems to mention, but actually it's a very, very urgent thing. So you have a bunch of analyses that show that actually fossil fuel production needs to decline by 5-6% per year, starting now, or actually starting maybe 3 years ago or 5 years ago.
As they say, starting yesterday.
Exactly. So it's not something it's not a theoretical debate that we need to resolve in 2050. It's something that needs to be tackled now. And so that's where this question becomes really important, because we need to figure out as you say, who's going to produce the last barrel of oil, and therefore who's going to stop producing first. And so you have several ways of looking at it, right? The first one is, and that's basically what Saudi Arabia says, it's let's keep oil cheap. So we are the least cost producer in the world, so we will be the last ones producing because we can continue producing for 30 years for a very cheap cost, right? That's their argument. Then you have arguments of countries like Norway that say, actually, we are in a constrained carbon budget, but we still need fossil fuels. So let's prioritize the lowest carbon intensity producers, because Norway powers their oil rigs with renewables. So technically, the carbon intensity of their production is lower than other countries. And also their democracy, et cetera, et cetera. So apparently that makes their oil okay. And finally, there's the model that we push, right? Which is actually none of that is going to work. We need a model of transitioning away or phasing out fossil fuels that's rooted in equity. And that's what we've been pushing for collectively as a civil society. That is, the countries that are the richest, the least dependent on their fossil fuel revenues, and they have the highest ability to actually get off of fossil fuel production, should be the ones phasing out first, because the other countries, whether in Africa or Asia or elsewhere, they need a bit more time because they need the revenues, and they don't have the technical, social, or economic capacity to get out of fossil fuels just like that, to turn off the tap. And so that's the model we're pushing for.
And this was our reading as CSE of the Global Stocktake outcome, where we were delighted that the goal to transition away from fossil fuels was written in the outcome document, but there was no differentiated timeline. There wasn't a kind of a roadmap for who goes first, who gets a little more time. So we published, as you are aware, a study called Equitable Fossil Fuel Phase-Out Science and Responsibility. The lead author of that report is our colleague Tamanna Sengupta, who's now pursuing her PhD in the US. And in this report, we wanted to, as CSE has always argued for a rules-based system to govern climate policy decisions around climate action, we actually came up with a framework to try to account for both historical responsibility in terms of carbon dioxide emissions and capacity to phase out fossil fuels. So combining these two indicators, so we analyzed 35 countries, taking a mix of emerging economies with growing energy demand, LDCs who are very low contributors to historical or even present-day CO2 emissions, petrostates like the Gulf countries, and big historical polluters like the US, Canada, Australia. And in analyzing these countries, and it's going to show up on the screen, we actually produced a roadmap for who should lead the way on the fossil fuel phase-out. And to no one's surprise, the countries that should lead the way are the US and Canada. They fall in our categorization, they fall under high capacity as well as high responsibility. Also in high capacity but moderate responsibility are Australia, Germany, the UK, Norway, Japan, and France. Also some of the usual suspects, given that these are also historical polluter countries. And other countries like many emerging economies, LDCs, have a much lower both responsibility as well as capacity. So the idea behind this analysis was to show that even if we just use available data and try to come up with a methodology to design some sort of a possible roadmap, A, it's possible, B, the results are pretty much what you would expect, but it's a question of actually getting that political buy-in and also kind of aligning these complex global markets to actually allow some of this to happen and facilitate something like this. So I guess the big question also is what happens to the rest of the world, particularly countries of the global south, many of whom have growing energy demand, vast energy poverty, and problems of energy access, also have aspirations to grow, develop, industrialize. I mean, these are all very, very legitimate goals and require large amounts of energy, a lot of which does require fossil fuels right now without access to the best technologies and so on. What happens to the global south and its access to the carbon budget? And what does an equitable transition look like? Like, what are some of those factors, drivers that are going to be crucial for that conversation?
I mean, it's as you know, it's an infinitely complex question because it also depends on the country and its situation, both domestically and internationally. But I think some of the things that we should keep in mind is that it's obviously all countries are going to have to get out of fossil fuels one way or another. We need to get to zero collectively at some point. That's extremely clear. And so what we've been pushing for is obviously to give some of the limited budget that's very, very limited at this stage to the countries that, as you say, have these very pressing needs in terms of energy access, development, industrialization, and degrees of fossil fuel consumption per capita that is like 20 times, 50 times lower than the US, or even Europe. Like, I'm not just focusing on the US, but the global north in general. And so it's obviously a question of getting out of fossil fuels, but fundamentally it's a question of how do you allow countries to drive their development and their industrial policies to get out of their dependence on fossil fuel extraction, for instance, on minerals or on commodities, basically, and really go up that value chain, and stop being in a situation where they're in, fossil fuels and debt loop that a lot of them are, where you need to extract more fossil fuels to pay off your debt, but you also generate more debt through international financing. So you need to continue. So you need to find, basically redesign the global financial architecture to allow these countries to have the economic and fiscal space to get out of fossil fuels and to be able to deploy renewable energy at the scale that they need for, as you say, their energy access and industrialization needs. And that is not going to happen without a redistribution of finance on the global stage, of power, without a rejigging of trade routes and trade mechanisms to allow countries to stop these south-north flows of resources and money, basically. And so, yeah, equity is an infinitely complex conversation, but without it, we're never going to meet our global objectives when it comes to climate or even development.
Multiple very complex questions facing developing countries. Also because countries of the global south have massive heterogeneity within them. You have large emerging economies like India, whose power demand is growing at 6 to 7% per year. You have your LDCs and your small island states who are suffering the worst brunt of the climate crisis, have contributed so little to it. You also have so many countries with aspirations to grow their manufacturing sector, to, as you said, move up the value chain. If they have critical minerals, they want to do more domestic processing, they want to build more industry. So I think the industrialization, manufacturing question is very central for a lot of the global south, and it just requires massive amounts of energy, which at this point necessitates fossil fuels to a large extent. So I think that's a big part of the challenge that developing countries are facing. And now you have this sort of big historical polluter that has already always been a problem, but is kind of just gone off the rails and is just planning more expansion. As you said, using fossil fuels as a bargaining chip in trade discussions and trade agreements. So this is the very, very complicated context in which we are doing climate diplomacy in this year and the years to come. We are also, as we said in the previous episode, facing so much of a geopolitical fragmentation, because ultimately decarbonization and equitable transition needs international cooperation, global coordination. I mean, these are all, I'm using a lot of words, but it just needs people to be friends and work together and, care about like who has polluted more and who has polluted less, and actually have like a good faith set of conversations around this. And we're not really seeing that. We're seeing countries become more inward, more insular, more fragmented. Energy security is becoming absolutely front and center. And one could argue that to a large extent, in many ways, renewable energy does provide that energy security. But in a large part of the zeitgeist right now, the understanding is that energy security means more fossil fuels. So that's also a separate complex debate, but that is what a lot of governments are thinking about right now. So how do we make this equitable energy transition, equitable fossil fuel phase out happen in this very fractured world? I think that's the big question that we're grappling with. And we will be delving into more of these issues and questions later this year. But thank you so much for being here, Roma, for sharing some of these very startling stats based on your research. And we will continue these conversations and look forward to having you back again sometime.
I would love that.
Thank you.